Poems to a Listener, readings and conversation with contemporary poets.
For whom do I speak now, so far away from home? For whom do I write now, so far away from myself? I speak for the experience of the flux I've become. I write for the concrete to fill in the distances from the house on the road I lived on, from the warm home on the sea I crossed, from old voices to the new. And I suppose that's true, to some extent, of shipping oneself far away from port, finding oneself while drifting.
Welcome. I'm Henry Lyman. And that was poet Andrew Salkey, reading from his book Away, published by Allison and Busby. In the poem, he speaks as one who's lived most of his life in exile, drifting, as it were, from country to country, further and further from his island home, Jamaica. But the sounds of the island still come to him, wherever he finds himself.
You know, I haven't been there for years and years and years, but I hear those sounds all the time. You know, when I lived in England, now that I live in the States, I hear those noises over and over again. And sometimes when it's very noisy where I am, I still hear those noises.
You say in the poem, I speak for the experience of the flux I've become. You are flux?
In the way that we are all the information we take in, the mixture of thoughts and ideas that weigh in on us as individuals. And these things are forever in motion.
And you write for that experience that's...
And you know why I tend to do this? Because it's the only way of what I would call filling in the distances, you see, from this point to that point.
From that home that you were...
From the house that I used to live in, you know, to the sea that I ultimately had to cross. From those nurturing old beautiful voices of the early formation of myself as a human being to these very new voices in exile. There was always the gouged frown that intended no umbrage, caused no injury, no shadow over the family table, no accusing line creasing the generations, only an open door into her own open wound, a salt pinch of light on her torment. Take the tear-streaked smile. The would-be exile once saw it when he walked in on her without knocking. Seconds, and she turned round smiling at his boyish way, and there, stippled on her cheek, the stigma of the years. "There's nothing here for you," she said. "Go away and do yourself some good." He went and stayed away. Today, in a climate not his own, he sees that stigma so clearly, his, an already opening rosebud.
What lay behind her wound, do you suppose? What lay behind? What was at the root?
Looking back, I tend to see that gouged frown that she wore on certain occasions as the worn and very marked face of motherhood and its awful burdens, the endless daily duties for others. Meaning me and my brother and other people in the society.
But it's something you carry with you today, too.
I do. I have a feeling that my stigma is linked to hers because in some sense, as soon as I started growing up, I took a little bit of herself on myself. And sometimes it holds me in shame. And
shame?
Then, yes, I feel ashamed. I feel ashamed and feel guilty for the pain I caused her, for the dislocation of spirit. There's a displacement of self to accommodate this other growing person. And there's a tightness in the forehead, terrible sensitive couchant awareness. A half-clenched fist of russet leaf, trapped on the summer front door mesh by a late September blow, seemed almost to be crashing for entry, its crispy crust of rustle pleading to be let into a house bulging with silence. A Wyeth perch on a highway, overstuffed with swollen indecision, rib-cage anger, shriveled ambition, and indoor plants, those green stand-in tricks for caring and displays of passion. The russet leaf, already spry with death, has chosen a good home for its crackling burial. The silence won't intrude. It is a silence in a house of exile.
Well, is it your exile from Jamaica that's holding you fast here? Or is it a sense of exile in general? A sense of being an exile in the world no matter where you are?
The latter, yes. No matter where I find myself, those are the tenets, precisely. In other words, we are exiled. Most of us are. I mean, I think that the state of being born is exile. You know, it's as soon as you leave the mother and the father, you leave that state of babyhood. You really do find yourself at sea.
But are you speaking entirely of existential exile based on the nature of the human animal? Or are you speaking of exile which is also a socially created sense of exile and estrangement and alienation and so on?
A stranger, you should want to separate those, you see. I find them inextricably bound up with each other. The alienation that I sense in what has happened to us West Indians in terms of our economics and our politics and so on.
Well, that's part of it.
I find that it's essentially a part of that alienation, spiritual desolation.
Also, on top of that is real exile, in your case, from your West Indian country, Londonwards, and then to the U.S., and on top of that is a strong sense of exile you feel within the societies in which you move, you know? If I may guess.
No, you're dead right. That's what I was hoping that you would get from the reading. It's not a very happy state to be in, really, you know. I like your way of seeing the flux and rush of everything as a sure way of seeing clearly everything there is to see. I really do. As a flood man myself, born just below your house, in a house like yours, I'm sure you know I understand your way. It's mine too. But my thing's been rushed off center by living years away from home, by seeing everything in bits and pieces, not as the whole you know you see yours as, flooding along the freeway in name only, making it all seem logically yours and bearable. Yet I do know your way. I think I know it well, like the inevitable downpour from the hills, the yes and no of everything we live through. I like your way of seeing it. I like it just as though I had dredged it up myself and made it all my own, living, as I do, absurdly far away from home.
Doesn't this have to do with the self-image of America as a kind of freeway?
Electrifying, very fast, almost with a studied inability to look behind.
Or on either side.
There's no sidelong view, no reckoning as you go. But it is something that I find also no stranger to my way of seeing things and my way of living. I too call myself a flood man, a flux and rush man.
But when you look on either side of the freeway, what do you see?
That weighs on the conscience of very many motorists and passengers rolling along the freeway. I remark always the wonderful thing of freedom that this country espouses over and over again, how wonderful we are to be free. But then very few people take into consideration equality. Equality, you see. Sometimes I would prefer a little bit of the freedom to be nipped in the bud and to give me lots of equality. In her offshore Manhattan mind, healing help is what she's always had to offer. She's been a mere conch shell's call away on her own small island, listening carefully to all the mounting promises of sweetness, more often than not sucked to trash. But she whispers her painless surgery throughout renewing spring and summer. The islanders and others move round her aimlessly. They hustle. They scream. They kill in her name. She holds out her hand, and there's that torch indicating the truth of her national intention. It's for all. It's very definitely for all. Through the corkscrew flame and the shadows and the mist and the swirl of contradictions, there's that tight expression on her face.
What do you think brings about that tight expression on the Statue of Liberty's face?
In all the contrariness and the contradiction, there is a sense of pain, a sense of deep, deep regret that she's unable to deliver that splendid promise. It hurts. It causes tightness across the forehead, across the eyes.
Well, I've seen that expression in a lot of people's faces, and I feel it in my own frequently.
You see, that tightness also makes us hustle more, makes us scream out aloud, and sometimes make us kill. It makes us move round that promise pretty aimlessly. But I like the way that the hand is still held out, and, you know, the torch, even though it's a little screwed up, it may be surrounded with endless shadows and the mists of uncertainty and indecision. It may be surrounded by a hell of a lot of contradictions.
And swirling.
Antagonisms, you know, but it's very much there. It's an intention. Scratching for a penny to knock against the one she held in her right fist, she hawked the city people for anything she could get. As always, they slipped past her without a glance. She knew they saw her from a long way off, coming at them on wings of deep need, spread wide like threats. At night, she huddled in a packing crate in a far corner of a railway yard. She hummed a monotony of refrains, dangerous only to herself, while picking at the holes in her one black cotton stocking which she had hooked out of a gutter the day before. Her island world didn't support rainbows or illusions. Her Kingston was a slashing knife, stalled at her throat. For how long she didn't know. The railway yard, like the city, was no place to expect signs of prophecy or ease. Into the city of blades next day, gripping her old penny, her body wired for insult and injury, her head fierce with curses, her eyes striking the street with defiance and yes, dread stiff on her shoulders like epaulets. She grazed the conscience of a woman who stopped, fidgeted, and gave her 2 oranges and a crumpled dollar bill. Her cold, rasping thank you spiked a nerve end at the back of the woman's neck. She wrapped the penny in the bill, stuffed it into the knot at the top of her stocking, and then raked one of the oranges with her fingernails, clawing the thick red rind clean from the pulp. Before she bit into it, she licked her lips, caked with hunger spit and street dust. It was a good day.
Hunger spit.
Hunger spit, yeah. Usually collects around here. And sometimes it acts like scales when it's dried around the front of the lips, you see. There's a lot of poverty at home. Lots of poverty. Terrible poverty.
Now this is in Kingston, but
Yes,
it could be anywhere, not necessarily Jamaica.
Throughout.
So she's very typical.
I think because she's so specific to me and to my life, I would say that she's typical to everybody else's life, you know.
But the woman whom she accosts on the street, her conscience is pricked.
Yes.
She's disturbed. She fidgets.
Yes, that other woman is obviously the poet, or whoever wants to be in her place.
Right. And I imagine she wears a tight expression on her face.
Very, very tight.
I know when I am accosted by a beggar, my own position in society, my middle classness, becomes questionable to me. It shows itself as being somehow illegitimate.
That's the same for me. I'm alerted. I become 2 selves, all in one. A self that is protected by salary, good marriage, children, books, and so on. And then a second self that says, that could be me in 2 years' time, 5 years' time. That could have been me from birth. 2 selves, really. The trees were thin and scarred. February Phildyke had knocked them about. They seemed on the teeter of disappearing before spring. The family, who stood in front of the split bark of the ravaged trees, was battered and tired of making do on stale air and stone promises from the bullies in the capital city. They, in turn, had lashed themselves to northern prongs and were themselves bullied in return. The tourists took photographs while talking trees and weather and rocks to the family. They talked high fluting, and the family stood on the slant, gaunt, loose-limbed. It was talk that was accurately space-filling. It was slippery, swerving away from politesse into condescension. It was something like Punic faith that the tourists had offered the family, and no doubt the tourists felt like traitors to ordinary human concern. They clicked away fiercely, as though they had deadlines, as though the family and the trees and the weather and the rocks were assigned cemetery property. My island has always, for me, been a tourist island. I used to find it difficult to take holidays. Don't know why, but somehow I resented the holiday that we offered to others and not to ourselves. As a child, I would see lots of cameras and shorts and pretty shirts and so on. You know, people wanting to take a picture want to manage you, however briefly. They want to arrange you and prettify you and so on.
The tourists taking photographs of this family of villagers would like to be nice. They would like to have some communication with these people on some ordinary human level.
And in fact they are.
They can't.
But they are nice, you see. They are, for the greater part, very decent people. In fact, I do say that they feel at the end of it all like traitors.
And they're embarrassed as a result, are they not? What is it that stands in the way?
I think it's the poverty that they're beholding, the raw poverty that they're beholding, possibly for the first time in their lives. Maybe. No wonder that when they're confronted by that, they end up by talking trees and talking weather and talking about the rocks.
To avoid the issue?
Yes. And their voices are high and fluting. They're very uneasy, you see, very uneasy. I didn't see tourists as bad people and, dangerous people. Most of them worked very hard and saved money to go down to the islands and have a good time for 2 weeks or a week and go back to the drudgery of northern industrial jobs in Chicago and New York and so on. The cold world doesn't spin on an apt ethical axis. It spins the best it can, and justice turns with it, but is so far out of reach it's duly unavailable. Besides, living teaches enviable self-sufficiency, while we scramble around for unobtainable completeness.
Well, it seems to me that completeness and self-sufficiency will always be out of reach as long as the planet continues to turn, as it were, on an unethical axis.
And for as long as we arrange ourselves the way we have arranged ourselves, I honestly feel that it's our ideas and our structuring that could be at fault. Maybe we're not thinking certain thoughts yet.
Well, we think of scrambling for this, scrambling for that form of completeness, or something that appears to give us completeness. Momentary pleasures, momentary joys.
Grab at this, grab at that, hit and miss.
There's that scrambling in the poem.
Frenzy of trial and error. There's a terrible rage in the search for success. It's a frenzy, a feeding frenzy, biting at this, biting down on that, trying this out, trying that out.
Well, I get into that myself sometimes. I try to avoid it, but...
Yes, it's happened to me too. I usually feel very calm after I've turned my back on it and said, shame, shame on you. Scurrying guilt, fear, loneliness, the bare minimum of our condition, how to rise above the vinculum bind, how to scale the maze of rigid doubt. Outside, digits go their discreet way, counting down the comeuppance blast of the one world we have on lease. Around that universal bid for Holocaust, there are nasty satellite frictions, Afrikaner hubris, Afrikaner squalor, Chilean nausea, contra doom, death trained on southern targets, seemingly, endlessly circling the vast threat, and with all the clarity of cataclysm. We hold our world in usufruct to nature. And there's the rub. We seem not to act with that in mind, constant pillage of the spirit of the contract, constant gouging of air land and water, constant decimation of dreamers and dreams. Seize the lever and freeze the digits. Quietly turn back the slide into white light.
We hold our world in usufruct to nature. Usufruct?
Fruitful use.
Fruitful use.
Yes. For instance, botanical gardens are in usufruct to the public. The sea around an island is held in usufruct. Nature's gift to all, just not to one person. But you can't take it away after you've made use, after you've looked at it. You can't grasp it personally, possessively. You have to leave it.
The nuclear arms threat, which the poem is referring to, is the very opposite of that kind of relation, the usufruct relation. It's
Yes.
It represents an absence of relation.
Yes. In other words, I am trying to say, hold off the technology of death, of destruction, and then virtually try to pull the bolt and walk out of that room back into the light of nature.
And into that relation.
We need to act in a principled way, all of us. We need to be principled in the sense that it embodies the wealth of salvation, the wealth of doing the right thing for the many. See, when we lead highly personal lives, individualism is a strange thing to live with, you know.
Seeking for self-sufficiency and individual completeness.
Yes, it's a very, very strange kind of companion.
Yeah.
And soon that kind of spirit is chock-a-block full of guilt and fear and loneliness, a kind of exile.
Can anyone be at home when there is so much homelessness and poverty and injustice? And finally, the central problem, which still exists, the central problem of nuclear arms. Can anyone have a home, a place to rest?
I suppose, in my own way of thinking, those who find new ways to make use of ego could be well on the way home. First, we must dream, and then the dream will make us act, and our action will change our world. We must always remember that dreaming is a way of loving, and when our love is strong, high walls will come crashing down. But first, we must dream. Then we must act, and we will change our world.
Poet Andrew Salkey, author of Away, published by Allison & Busby. I'm Henry Lyman. Thanks for joining us.
Poems to a Listener was produced by Henry Lyman in cooperation with WFCR, Amherst, Massachusetts. This program was supported by the Witter Binner Foundation for Poetry and the National Endowment for the Arts.